Hello there. Now that Rishi Sunak has spilled the lockdown beans, there needs to be a full no-holds-barred investigation. If you haven't already done so, please subscribe and then like and comment below. And why not buy a mug with my mug on it? So if Rishi Sunak is to be believed, the UK cabinet stumbled almost knowingly into an economy and society destroying series of lockdowns. But is he telling the whole story? And Liz Truss has also jumped on that bandwagon, saying she would never in future order a lockdown. Speaking to The Spectator last week, Rishi Sunak, who was Chancellor of the Exchequer during the pandemic, painted a picture of weak ministers sat around listening to advisers offering options and hoping that some solution would leap out and present itself. And the trigger that forced them into the lockdown option, said Sunak, was the moment Professor Neil Ferguson appeared on the scene with his now infamous doomsday predictions. 500,000 lives versus shutting the country down for a while. The trouble was that no one was considering the wider long-term implications of this on the economy and on society itself. All those ministers appeared to think that someone else was doing the job of assessing the future repercussions. The mantra appeared to be that if we do everything to save lives right now, then it must be good for the economy. No need to consider anything else, so nothing else mattered. Just like the rest of the developed world seemed to be doing. So was anyone anywhere doing long-term assessments? Or were they all buried? And if so, why? Anyway, we now hear from Rishi that there were dissenting voices, including his, and they were shut down, and even the SAGE meeting minutes were doctored to make it look like everyone agreed there was only one way out of this health risk: full lockdown. So it does make it sound like UK ministers made the collective decision to do so amongst themselves, doesn't it? And people are now either saying Rishi is a hero to point all this out, while others say he should have resigned and immediately blown the gaff. But all this ignores one possible intervention. Remember that China was already imposing brutal lockdowns, and Italy was in lockdown of its own, with the European Union following suit. But the UK's direction had not yet been fully defined. Here's what Reuters reported back in March 2020, just days after France went into full lockdown. On Friday evening, Johnson ordered pubs, restaurants, theatres, cinemas and gyms to shut their doors to slow the accelerating spread of the disease, days after other European countries put their citizens on lockdown. French newspaper Libération, citing sources in Macron's office, said Johnson's decision came after the French leader gave him an ultimatum on Friday morning, threatening an entry ban on any traveller from the UK if there were no new measures. No one seems to remember that these days. Now, this was EU politics, and outside of the pandemic, Brexit was still a big issue. Well, actually, it's still as big an issue. So I would reckon that if this did happen, Macron was chosen as the messenger to convey the EU threat to Downing Street because of the travel connections between France and the UK. And Macron would have been the one EU leader most glad to do so. But it is very telling that one EU country really bucked the lockdown consensus and did their own thing: Sweden. So why weren't the Swedish also ordered to get in line with the rest? Raising the possibility that the talk of a Macron threat was just a ruse, a get-out clause for Boris Johnson to use if everything went pear-shaped. Or was it Macron's team leaping at the opportunity to fabricate a story that makes their boss look like a strong leader with clout over the UK? Actually, no one's mentioning it now, so making it look like some people are very keen to ensure no one looks in that particular direction. And when you look at the missing pandemic billions, you can be sure that there will be others who are just as keen to see attention deflected as well. But behind all this, you have to remember that the nation was expecting the government to follow the science, and that's what they had to say in Parliament. And the cases and deaths were on the rise. What would have been the outcome if Boris had said, well, the scientists say we should do this, but I'm going to do the opposite? Keir Starmer would have had a field day. So as ever, the government followed the short-term route and buried the long-term assessment. But as I've already said, that looks to me like every other developed country in the world, as they did the same. The US, Canada, just about all EU countries, Australia, New Zealand. Don't let someone deflect you from the fact, if lockdowns were a disaster here, they were a disaster for everyone. But they all went for it without long-term impact assessments, and some went the whole hog with medical interventions, didn't they? Where was all this led from? And isn't that the really big issue that should be looked into and addressed? And in fact, the most important science of the day was the fear-mongering deployed by those psychology-driven nudge units around the world, all designed to keep the majority of the population scared and controllable. And that's another scandal. At the end of the day, I will never believe any single minister or former minister about what went on in those meetings, because at the end of the day they were more than happy to be bound by cabinet collective responsibility to order the country into lockdown. But there should be a full investigation into these actions and whether they really were necessary. But the danger to some is that they'll be found out. So they will be hoping that by next February, when the cost of living crisis is killing people, that they can use the usual large broom to sweep the whole lockdown mess under that extremely lumpy carpet in the bowels of Westminster.